Triglav Historical Shows, Igor Górewicz presents Swords of Europe. Project co-financed by the EU 2007 to 2013, Operational Programme West Pomerania. Cut, chop and thrust, the sword through the millennia. We would like to present the history of the sword through the millennia. From its emergence in the Bronze Age until this unusual form, the flamberge. How the sword changed its shape and partly its purpose.
So, if this is the great flamberge sword, what is the ancestor of the broadsword? Where does it all begin?
The bronze sword is said to emerge about 1700 BC out of such bronze daggers like this one. This is the likely ancestor of the sword. We have proof that through continuous sharpening, the blade was becoming narrower, to finally become a kind of spike. Perhaps a dagger caster might have decided to make a longer version once, and then the first sword was made.
So, if the Bronze Age dagger is the ancestor of the broadsword, when did the dagger become more like a sword? When did it become longer and why?
The first broadswords were thrusting weapons. The European medieval swords we know are the results of an elaborate idea. However, it was reached by centuries of trial and error. This is how the sword's blade first appeared. This specimen does not have a tang up to the hilt. The warrior had to be skilled. The natural reaction of the human being is to hit with a club or stick, not to thrust. We have to practice to be prepared to inflict thrusting blows with a weapon.
So, when did they consider the development of a crossguard, something to protect their hands when the sword is thrusting, so it doesn't slide over the blade?
It happened in the Hellenic world, where the so-called Mycenaean horn swords emerged. The upper part of the blade rises to form the horns towards the hand. This is not yet a proper lower guard blocking the opponent's blade and protection on the hand. It only protects the hand from slipping down the blade when a powerful thrust is made. The Mycenaean swords still have the central ridge that reinforces the blade. In time, they were becoming longer. Interestingly, this sword is point-heavy. Even though this is usually the case in cutting, not thrusting weapons.
This is still a rapier. When did the blade begin to take a different shape? When did the blade begin to suggest that swords were being used for hacking and not just thrusting?
The Mycenaean culture shifted from purely thrust weapons to hack and thrust ones. What is more, from purely elite weapons that required a lot of training and expense, to more egalitarian ones, much shorter swords emerged, with a broad blade designed for cutting. This one was designed for foot soldiers, probably ones from the lower classes and less skilled.
The tang is longer, it's getting longer, but the blade is still narrow.
That's right. The tang is clearly visible. The grip is superimposed on the tang and a pommel is added. This is a transitory stage. The earlier forms already had a nice clear tang or reinforcing bar. The so-called full hilt swords were found in Northern Europe. They are significantly different. The hilt is not attached to the sword. The blade and hilt are made from one piece of metal. So, there is no critical point where the sword is likely to break. This sword has a broad blade. The balance is set near the point, which makes it a cutting weapon. Yet, it has a very sharp point, so it can be effectively used for thrusting blows.
The swords become longer and heavier. If they become longer and heavier, when does the development of a counterbalance, a pommel, in conjunction with the blades becoming more tip heavy, so they can deliver a heavy hack or a heavier thrust? When do the swords balance more?
This Calamus leaf blade has a few interesting aspects. Firstly, it can be used for hacking. But due to the curved line of the edge, it does not require a lot of strength to cut with it when it is properly sharpened. The blade is visible widened in its upper part, which makes it point heavy and larger at the same time, but better balanced. Not only does it have a full bronze hilt, which makes it heavier, but also has an upper guard. This is a next stage. This time, the sword was casted as a one-piece weapon. Unlike earlier stages, when the hilt had to be fixed by means of rivets to the blade. This sword is very heavy and solid.
So this sword has more reach. So they're starting to be able to reach out to strike their opponent, maybe from horses or chariots, but it still has thrusting capability. But we see by the wider blade and the very heavy section here, this is a blade that's designed to stab and chop, but reach people. Why is this? Show me a sword that has been designed just for striking, a sword that has been designed for a war machine.
I have one. A Hallstatt sword. It has no point. You cannot pierce anything with it. Especially not an armed opponent. It is a heavy weapon, point heavy, with a light hilt. It is made for hacking and was mostly used by chariot riders. It is typical of the Hallstatt swords, like this, is the Mexican head-shaped pommel. See how complicated the cross-section of the blade is. It is still hilted by rivets, which is not very reliable, but the tang goes almost to the pommel.
So the hilt and the pommel sometimes were very fragile. Only this part of the sword was used for delivering a heavy downward blow from above down. So this is the first really scientific military development of the sword, possibly. Once we get past the charioteers, we realise that this metal has no memory. They're looking for a metal now that they can bend and will recover without breaking eventually. So technology is bringing in iron. And then we have another development of a weapon that is the Bronze Age sword. It had to come to an end with the Bronze Age. The development of a metal with more memory and more flexibility, a harder metal, iron. When do we begin to see the development of the Iron Age sword?
It happened namely in the Hallstatt culture, where the previous bronze sword came from. Swords became larger so that they could be used by chariot riders or horsemen. This is when a new material was adopted, iron. That culture left behind both bronze and iron swords that were similar and succeeded them. The Hallstatt culture was followed by the Latin culture, a clearly Celtic one. This culture produced different swords, but this long, heavy one was the most typical shape. It has parallel blades, an almost rounded point, and a characteristic grip. Like the Hallstatt swords, it is an almost purely hacking weapon for horsemen and footmen. This is when the sword started developing in two different directions. This was the Celtic sword. We will return to it later. And here is the Greek Sefa sword. It appeared in 9th century BC, also based on various types of bronze swords. The blade is still the Calamus leaf type. Like in other older swords, it has a sharp point. It is reinforced by a central ridge, and there is more. It is not only well counterbalanced, in addition, it is something that looks like your typical crossguard. However, this is not a crossguard that had been attached. It had been shaped from the very blade. It is not a separate element, like in the case of later swords, such as medieval knight swords. The lower guard is a part of the blade. Only the grip is fixed to the blade.
So we have a heavy section, a rigid blade, and for the first time I feel I have a sword that almost feels like a modern sword, like a medieval broadsword. It has a strong crossguard, it has a well-balanced feel to it. It still has a heavy tip, so I know that this is still for striking, and it has a very, very sharp distal tip. So it's obviously it's used for penetrating armour. And I would say that it's almost certain this was used for the first time in conjunction with a shield. So again we have a possible development of the sword in relation to some other equipment, some other artifact of war, not necessarily a machine but a shield. And then the sword becomes eventually even shorter and even more effective as a thrusting weapon, because There's little necessity to use this other than to strike in an arc over into your opponent. So two strange developments from the Greeks. What do you think about this?
The Spartans, being a specific kind of the Greek culture, being professional warriors, while preserving the shape of the Sephos, significantly reduced its size. The Greeks fought using large shields. The battle was a clash of two phalanxes. What they did was in fact pushing against one another. The distance was less than 50 centimeters. The warriors would be pushing forward, hidden behind their own and their comrades' shields. On their left and right side, while the opponent's shields were also in their way. There was simply no room to handle a weapon this long. It was very uncomfortable. Hacking or cutting is possible at a larger distance like this. In close combat, a very short sword would deliver thrusts from above and is much more effective. More than 1,000 years divide between these two.
So now we've seen the sword develop further. We saw the development of the sword in the Bronze Age for use with war machines with a chariot. Now we have the sword developing again, relating to formations, tactics, and in relation to other weapons like the spear. It's becoming a combination of weapons, and this is affecting the development of the sword. The Celts have a long sword which they are using to fight each other and some other cultures. Then they meet the Romans. When they attack the Romans with their long sword, the Romans are using shields.
During the Punic Wars, Hannibal put forward his diversely equipped army, including Celto-Iberians. It was different than the Latin swords. It was adopted by the Romans as gladius hispaniensis. It gave rise to the typical Roman gladius. The Roman soldiers used as a thrust weapon, with the large scutum shield and at a close distance. The thrusts would be delivered in between shields or from above. Let's now go back to the Celts.
This is a long weapon. It's still a long weapon, and you have a shorter, more effective thrusting weapon. The Romans are using shields. What happens when the Celtic warrior attacks the Roman?
This shows the difference between the fighting style of the barbarian Celts and the Romans. The Celts would fight as individual warriors, even when they were in large groups. They would rush to attack and prove their valour, swinging the sword and delivering wide blows, in order to give the maximum impact to their large weapons. The Romans, on the contrary, were disciplined and organised. Which is why the Roman writers advised the legionists how to withstand the feared Celtic sword. There were two methods. One was to take advantage of the weaknesses of the material these swords were made of. Not all of them were made of good quality iron. and they would bend after a single ineffective blow. This is when the warrior had to fix it using his own foot, as the sources tell us. Kind of metal differed from Damascus ones. The Roman soldier could use this moment to strike back. The second weakness was to take the strike on the upper rim of the shield. And when the Celt was unprotected, deliver a thrust into the exposed parts of the body. After the Celts, other barbarians started attacking the Roman Empire.
This new wave of barbarians, what did these waves of barbarians bring with them to the theatre of war?
The new threat was the horsemen, powerful bands of cavalry. Like the Goths brought along long swords. We can start referring to these as the Sparta. The Romans adjusted their style of fighting, as any army adapting tactics and weapons to the opponent. Of course, cavalry cannot use short thrust weapons. That's why the cavalry, Sparta, was used. Its task was delivering strong blows from above, meaning from the saddle.
Again, it's fair to say that we see a sword development in direct relation to military tactics. The beginning of a combination of different materials in the hilt, but in a crossguard, and a pommel, albeit more decorative than heavy.
The pommel is light, being made of bone or antler. It is not to counterbalance the sword. It was not necessary. This sword was supposed to drop. It was driven by the hand. Its sheer weight and point heaviness made the strength of the strike crushing. The grip, pommel and crossguard have the same function as in the case of the gladius, which had a wooden grip for the firmness of hold, not for providing counterbalance. It is the same function as in the horned Mycenaean sword.
We're still with this diamond section with a strong ridge. Where does the sword go from here?
There were two basic types of the Sparta. This specimen is early 4th century. It is based on a find from the Nidam Bog in Denmark. It has a pattern welded blade, and it has several fullers. There usually were 1 to 4 of them. A single wide fuller was typical of later swords. This, again, is a powerful hacking sword.
We have fullers. We know that metal is now becoming more advanced, more flexible, stronger, more rigidity can be achieved in the blade, which is interesting because this also, we see a reference to this when we go back to the Bronze Age. Again, with these fullers, we can see another transition. The transition now is to even better quality steel, and this time they're able to achieve the same strength but with one single fuller.
Yes, this is a later 5th century Frankish sword with one wide fuller. It is still long. It is still a variant of the Sparta. The grip developed significantly though. This is from 450 AD, the late Roman period. It was found in Denmark. The grip already resembles a Viking Age one, with a quite a wide lower guard and fairly developed upper guard and pommel. It is narrow though, and does not provide much balance. It is wooden or antler, as is the guard. They are only held together by metal plates from the bottom and the top, which are riveted down. This is not a very sturdy protection from an enemy's sword. 8th century. The grip is already Viking Age-like, pattern-welded blade, much narrower and pointed, still used to produce legendary swords.
Now we see the implication of preference. Thrusting, not thrusting. The warriors are beginning to make decisions, personal choices. The swords are taking on different functions. Some swords like this are for hacking, whereas this sword, like you say, is still the Sparta and is still able to thrust. Clearly, there is a development of martial skill, a martial art coming into the design of the Western sword, and the swords are beginning to become more like the broadsword, but we're still limited by metal technology. There must be another progression to push things forward.
I agree in part, but I don't believe in advanced fencing techniques in the 8th century. Of course, professional warriors knew their combat skills, which is shown in their hilt construction. Here, we have an actual counterbalance, even though it's a heavy Sparta, a hacking weapon. When you deliver a strike, it returns right back, and you are immediately ready for a next one.
So we're talking about balance, and we're talking about the maneuverability of the sword, the ability to change direction. This means that the martial level now has reached the situation where they can use the sword against the sword. Weapon can fight weapon. You can set weapons aside. A weapon can now set a weapon aside, yet it can change direction. Maneuverability. But we still need to find a stronger material. An advance in technology is needed to make the sword go further. There's more blade contact.
You are right, but Scandinavian sagas contain descriptions of duels. Some of them, especially the ritual ones called holmgang, were exchanges of powerful strikes intended to break the opponent. What is more, we know that shields would be broken too. Another breakthrough were the swords signed with the name Ulfberth, now made of steel. Here is an 11th century specimen showing the next stage of hilt development. But let's not focus on the blade. This one, which is non-typical, is tapered and is more pointed. This weapon allows much better handling. It can be used for striking, for thrusting, and slashing. It is not just for hacking and breaking shields. In the late 10th century, new types of grips appeared. The lower guards were no longer short and sturdy, but definitely real crossguards, simple, long, and with a function. They could be used for locking the enemy blade, pushing it away if a need arose. Even strike with it. The pommel was no longer decorative, but purely practical. Ulfberth gave away to other producers, like the famous Ingelri. The swords were becoming longer, more pointed, and the iconography shows their incredible piercing power. They were capable of splitting a helmet in half. In the Song of Roland, set in the 8th century, but written in the 10th century, states that a strike by the sword of a highly skilled and trained professional warrior is so powerful that an opponent could be split from the helmet through the shoulders and torso in halves, together with his saddle and the back of his horse. It was a highly effective weapon. We are at the early Knight period. We have discussed a sword able to cut through chainmail. But the development of the sword was countered by the development of protective armour. Armour plates were being added to chainmail, thus older swords were no longer effective. This is where two new concepts come in. Some swords became heavier and longer, as we shall see. Secondly, they needed to penetrate armour better. This is a breakthrough moment. A Type 14 single-handed sword from the turn of the 14th century. On the one hand, the blade is still flat, thus made for hacking, while near the point it has a diamond cross-section. It is reinforced by a central ridge, a powerful one-handed sword. Since now on, swords have gone in two directions. The so-called great swords and one-handed swords. These were Romanesque swords. We are passing on into the Gothic era. The swords of that time had to match highly effective protective armour. One strategy was extreme power, used in order to at least strike the opponent down. The other was to try and penetrate his protection. This brings us to the 14th century one-handed sword.
You can see now that the sword is evolving. It's becoming longer. It still has a strong ridge. It's still good for the thrust. But there is the ability to place two hands on the hilt, even though it's still a single-handed sword. And the quillons are becoming longer, and they have these turns, sometimes called acorns, which are used to disarm the opponent and, in the bind, damage the opponent's hands. And fight masters such as Talhofer, for example, began a whole school of European martial arts There are many, many fight books from the 14th, 15th centuries onwards. The earliest known fight book we have is I-33, of course. Talhofer and the German style talked about different wards, different stances. For example, the iron gate, the plough, and so forth. Crossed over into a whole martial philosophy, a true Western martial art. Well, here's another example. Many variations, 15th century, single-handed. Again, we're still retaining the strong ridge, the diamond section. It's still thrusting, it's still for hacking. Long quillons. Same period, we go back to the sword of Henry V. It's a single-handed sword, surprisingly light, obviously designed to be worn as a sidearm. It has long quillons with acorns, which are very, very good for trapping the opponent's blade and for inflicting damage on the opponent's hands. It's very, very light, very well balanced. It's obviously a weapon that's designed to be very maneuverable.
But we are talking about the one-handed sword, whose role was to increase its piercing ability. This is when Europe split into two zones. Since the 13th century, in the north, east and the middle, the strategy of powerful strikes became dominant. Fighting was intended to break through enemy armour. This is a Type 13 13th century sword, the so-called bastard sword. The long hilt allowed the knight to grab it by both hands for greater impact. This is Eastern, Central and Northern Europe. Western and Southern Europe loved what you just showed, thrusting weapons. Spain, Italy, the west of France, England, this is a weapon for them. In Poland, Germany or Scandinavia, this version of the sword was dominant. These swords gave rise to a very universal weapon. Like these two swords, the oak shot 16A and 17. This is how the famous Teutonic Order swords could be like. The swords of Central European knights at the turn of the 15th century. A universal cut and thrust weapon. A flat section of the blade, yet enforced and hexagonal. This specimen has an even more definitive heavy blade and can be used for various strikes.
Swords have become more powerful, more devastating, more effective. Longer blades, better counterbalances, pommels, longer grips. This is another development, an answer to the heavier and more effective armour that's being developed. Cavalry and infantry are now wearing full plate, and the only way to break through this is to smash it or stab it, find the joints in the armour. Again, there's going to be escalation. Swords are going to become heavier and heavier, longer and longer range.
Yes, but only so far. There was a limit to this arms race. Between the improving armour and the advanced combat techniques, as well as other types of weapons, sometimes replacing the sword. Swords with more intricate hilts emerged. The ricasso, degerent types of grips, like in the Spanish sword from the turn of the 16th century. The crossguard was extended with protective quillons that were becoming more effective, shielding the hand from injuries and serving to intercept enemy weapons. This was practically the end of the knightly sword. Gunpowder caused reduction in armoury. Also, the sword was able to become lighter and lighter.
So at the end of the knightly sword, the noble sword, swords become, like you say, simpler and smaller. We get into basket hilts and then rapiers and small swords, and the fencing eventually becomes very, very delicate. What about these big swords?
16th to 17th century two-handed swords, while one-handed swords evolved into short basket swords, rapiers, and finally, épées. There was also an extreme solution, weighing 4.5 kilograms.
Ekstremalnego rozwoju miecza, który ważył 4,5 kg, służył zawodowym żołnierzom, najemnikom, którzy zwali siebie Landsknechtami.
It was used by professional mercenaries named the Landsknechts.
Służyła do dwóch celów: rozbijania pik.
It was worn naked on the arm. It was an infantry weapon with two purposes: breaking pikes and stopping cavalry by hacking the legs of horses. This weapon is so huge and heavy that it had to have a long ricasso one could grab as well. Again, we have an entire quillen system with the so-called Perea Haken hooks for intercepting. It was held by both hands and had a terrible power. It was, of course, not used in duels.
This is the largest of non-ceremonial swords.
We have reached the 17th century, the end of the 3,400 years of the history of the sword in Europe. To sum up, the bronze sword emerged in 1700 BC, as a purely thrusting weapon. It evolved into cut and thrust weapons, and finally the bronze sword became a purely hacking weapon. This was also the function of the first iron swords, from hacking weapons to cutting ones. Through specialized piercing weapons, with the era of the barbarians in the 2nd and 3rd century, to the 9th, where the swords were mainly cutting weapons, then again, specialization occurred in thrusting abilities once more. Middle Ages brought a great diversity in the function of the sword, along two lines of development. On the one hand, increasing size and weight, the resulting swords became heavy, having greater strikes, and on the other, a narrower, stiffer and pointier blades that pierced armour. The end of European armour was also the end of the sword, which evolved into the rapier, the épée, and in some regions, the basket sword.
So, it's true what you say. It was not, the evolution of the sword was not a random collection of events. It was a true evolution. Like anything on this planet, like any of the animals or flora, the sword has developed from a single ancestor, and it has progressed and diversed along its route into swords for different functions, relating to different aspects of martial combat and warfare, producing many different kinds of swords. And along the way we see some swords that were probably less effective than others, but always the sword is reinventing itself.